The Phoenix account. The first sign was the teacup. It was fine bone china, with delicate blue forget-me-nots hand-painted around the rim, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Eleanor Vance's hand, usually so steady, trembled as she lifted it, and the cup met the saucer with a sharp, discordant clink. The sound seemed to hang in the air of her pristine, silent living room, a tiny fracture in the perfect facade she maintained. Across from her, her son, David, and his wife, Chloe, exchanged a glance. It was a quick, almost imperceptible thing, but Eleanor caught it. It was the same look they'd been giving her for months, a mixture of pity, impatience, and a simmering calculation that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "You seem a bit on edge today, Mom," David said, his voice dripping with a concern that didn't reach his eyes. He was a handsome man, her David, with his father's strong jaw and her own soft brown eyes, though lately, they seemed to have hardened into something cold and assessing. "I'm perfectly fine, dear," Eleanor replied, forcing a calm she didn't feel into her voice. "Just tired. I didn't sleep well." "It's the anxiety," Chloe chimed in, her voice a syrupy balm. She leaned forward, her designer blouse rustling softly. "We're worried about you, Eleanor. All this stress. It's not good for your heart. And these new ideas you have." Eleanor's stomach tightened. The ideas. It had started subtly. She'd mentioned, over dinner she'd paid for, that she felt it was time she managed her own finances more closely again. David had handled them since Robert died, a temporary measure that had stretched into 5 years. She'd suggested gently that perhaps the monthly allowances she gave them, which had ballooned to cover their extravagant mortgage, car leases, and Chloe's shopping sprees, might need to be adjusted. She was 71 after all. Her retirement funds weren't infinite. Her reasonable suggestions had been reframed as paranoia. Her desire for independence was labeled as confusion. Her questioning of their expenses was agitation. They had built a case against her with such insidious care that she'd almost started to believe it herself. "It's just that we care so much," Chloe continued, her hand fluttering to her chest. "We only want what's best for you. And Dr. Evans agrees. A little time at Oakhaven could be so beneficial. It's not a hospital, it's a wellness center. Rest." Haven. The name was meant to sound peaceful, a haven among oak trees. Eleanor had looked it up. It was a private psychiatric facility. Very expensive one. Her money would be paying for her own imprisonment. "I don't need a rest," Eleanor said, her voice firmer now. "I need you to stop treating me like I'm senile. I am canceling the automatic transfers, effective next month. You are both adults. It's time you acted like it." The silence that followed was absolute. The mask of concern on David's face slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a wounded expression. "Mom, how can you say that? After everything we've done for you." "What have you done for me, David?" The question left her lips before she could stop it, born of 3 years of lonely dinners, of unreturned phone calls, of being used as a human ATM. "You took the special people to the French Laundry for your anniversary last week. I read about it on Instagram. I who paid for your first car, your college, the down payment on that house. I had to find out about my own son's anniversary dinner on a social media app." Chloe's face went rigid. David looked away, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The special people comment, a careless cruelty Chloe had let slip months ago, had become the unspoken truth of their relationship. "That was a business dinner, Mom," David muttered, a weak, transparent lie. Eleanor stood, her legs feeling unsteady. "I think you should leave." "Mom, wait," David began, but Chloe stood, cutting him off with a sharp gesture. "It's okay, David. She's not herself." Chloe's eyes met Eleanor's, and for the first time, the pretense of sweetness was entirely gone. Her gaze was flat and cold like a shark's. "We'll talk when you're feeling more stable." They left, the heavy front door clicking shut with an air of finality. Eleanor stood in the sudden silence, the tremble in her hands becoming a full-body shake. She had drawn a line in the sand. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would not respect it. They would simply redraw the map. 2 days later the knock came. It was early, just past 8 a.m. Two polite but firm men stood on her porch, their postures radiating a bland, official authority. Behind them, parked at the curb, was a discreet van with the Oakhaven crest. "Eleanor Vance?" the taller one asked. "We're here for your transport to Oakhaven. Your son, David Vance, has arranged for your admission." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. "There's been a mistake. I'm not going anywhere. I'm afraid it's a mandatory 72-hour hold, ma'am. For your own safety. Signed by Dr. Evans." He held out a clipboard with a document. Her vision swam as she saw David's signature, right beside the name of the psychiatrist Chloe had insisted she see exactly once. They hadn't just redrawn the map. They had set the whole world on fire. The 72-hour hold began with a profound and systematic stripping of her identity. Her clothes were taken and replaced with soft, shapeless scrubs. Her wedding ring, the last tangible piece of Robert, was inventoried and locked away. Her phone, her connection to the outside world, was confiscated. She was led to a room that was more cell than bedroom. A single bed bolted to the floor, a desk anchored to the wall, a small, reinforced window looking out onto a courtyard surrounded by a high fence. The door clicked shut, the lock engaging with a sound that echoed in the hollow of her chest. She was a prisoner. Her crime was her money, and her vulnerability was their key. The first day was a blur of assessments and medications she refused. She met Dr. Mercer, the attending physician at Oakhaven, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much. He asked her questions, and she answered with a desperate, clear-headed logic. "My son and daughter-in-law are doing this to gain control of my finances," she told him, her voice raw but steady. "I am not paranoid. I am being exploited." Dr. Mercer made a note on his tablet. "That's a very serious allegation, Eleanor." David and Chloe seemed terribly concerned. They provided extensive documentation of your erratic behavior, canceling important payments, accusing them of theft, isolation. "They're lying. They mentioned you've been having memory lapses. Do you often forget things, Eleanor?" It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Every fact was twisted, every truth reframed as a symptom. By the end of the session, she felt the first true tendrils of doubt coil around her own mind. Was she crazy? Had she imagined the calculating looks, the financial leaks, the cold dismissal? That night, lying on the thin mattress, listening to the muffled cries of another patient down the hall, Eleanor Vance broke. She cried for Robert, for the life they had built, for the son she had lost to a woman's greed. The tears were hot and silent, a private flood of grief and terror. But as the dawn light began to bleed into the room, something else rose from the ashes of her despair. Cold, hard fury. They thought she was weak. They thought she was a confused old woman who would crumble under pressure. They had thrown her in this place to break her, to provide the final proof of her incompetence. Fine. If they wanted instability, she would give them instability. But it would be on her terms. She would no longer try to prove her sanity to Dr. Mercer. She would prove their corruption to a judge. And to do that she needed evidence. She needed to turn this prison into her own personal courtroom. The genteel legal battle was indeed over. This was a fight for her very freedom, and it would be a dirty one. She would weaponize the very mental instability they had accused her of. She would perform a masterpiece of madness, a performance so convincing it would expose the ugly truth festering beneath Oakhaven's serene surface. The game was on. The fluorescent lights of the common room hummed a flat, monotonous note that seemed to vibrate inside Eleanor's skull. It was day 2. The shock had worn off, replaced by a hyper-alert, analytical calm. She sat in a worn armchair, a book open but unread on her lap, and observed. The room was a study in controlled sterility. Beige walls, scuffed linoleum, furniture bolted down. It was populated by a dozen other souls, each lost in their own private weather. A young man rocked rhythmically in a corner, his lips moving in a silent, frantic conversation. An older woman with beautifully coiffed silver hair meticulously folded and refolded a napkin, her movements precise and haunted. And then there were the staff. Nurse Brenda, a stout woman with a permanent smirk, who dispensed medication with the bored efficiency of a factory worker on an assembly line. And Aide Ben, younger, with kind eyes that often looked overwhelmed. Eleanor watched Brenda especially closely. She saw how her eyes lingered a little too long on the expensive watch of the woman folding napkins. Mrs. Gable, she'd heard her called. She saw how Brenda's tone turned sharp and condescending with the rocking young man, whose name was Leo. This was her new chessboard. These were the pieces. Her first move came during morning group therapy, led by a therapist named Janine who spoke in a voice so artificially soothing it set Eleanor's teeth on edge. "Today, let's talk about trust," Janine began, her gaze sweeping the circle. "Who in your life has made you feel safe?" The answers were a litany of pain and broken connections. When it was Eleanor's turn, she let her hands tremble visibly in her lap. She looked at Janine with wide, frightened eyes. "They're listening," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with a feigned tremor. Janine leaned forward. "Who's listening, Eleanor?" "The voices in the walls," she said, injecting a note of desperate conviction. "They work for her. For Chloe. They tell her everything I say." She glanced furtively at the ceiling vent. There in the vents was a risk. It was the kind of classic textbook paranoia they would expect from a truly deteriorating mind. But she had to establish her symptoms to make her future actions believable. Janine made a note. "Thank you for sharing that, Eleanor. That must feel very frightening." Nurse Brenda, observing from the back of the room, rolled her eyes. The reaction was perfect. Eleanor was now filed away in Brenda's mind as just another delusional old woman. Non-threat. Her second move was more strategic. After lunch, she saw Brenda leading Mrs. Gable back to her room, her hand firmly on the older woman's elbow. Mrs. Gable was protesting weakly. "My ring. I just want my ring back. It was my mother's." "It's safe in the inventory, Helen," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false patience. "You'll get it back when you're discharged." Eleanor saw the avaricious glint in Brenda's eye. She understood. The staff's access to patient belongings was a temptation, a system ripe for abuse. Later, during a prescribed quiet time, Eleanor found herself sitting next to Leo in the courtyard. He was still rocking, his eyes fixed on the fence. "They're stealing from her, you know," Eleanor said softly, not looking at him. Leo's rocking slowed. He didn't look at her, but he was listening. The tall nurse, Brenda. She took Mrs. Gable's ring. "She's not going to give it back." Leo's hands clenched. "They took my sketchbook," he murmured, his voice a raw scrape. "Said the drawings were agitated." He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were startlingly intelligent, burning with a trapped, artistic fire. "They don't understand. They just take." A silent understanding passed between them. An alliance was forged in that sun-drenched, fenced-in courtyard. Leo was not just a patient. He was a witness, and he had his own reasons to despise the system. The climax of her plan, the masterstroke, required a public performance. She waited for the evening shift change, when the hallway was busiest. She had been practicing in her room, letting the fear and rage she truly felt boil to the surface, then channeling it into a specific, targeted outburst. As Nurse Brenda walked past her open door, Eleanor launched herself from her chair. She didn't go for Brenda. That would be seen as aggression. Instead, she ran to the wall and pressed her ear against it, her body trembling with a convincing, theatrical violence. "They're here," she shrieked, her voice a piercing thing of pure terror. "Chloe sent them. The men in the walls. They're saying they're going to take my money and leave me here to die." She collapsed to the floor, sobbing, making sure her body blocked the hallway. Staff came running. Dr. Mercer was summoned. "Eleanor, what's going on?" Dr. Mercer asked, his voice strained. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. The voices. They said Nurse Brenda has my file. She's changing it. She's working with my daughter-in-law. She has Mrs. Gable's ring in her locker. She brags about it to the voices. She was careful to lace the truth, the ring, within the fabric of her delusion. The effect was electric. Brenda's face, which had been smug, drained of all color. That's a lie. She's crazy. But the seed was planted. Dr. Mercer's eyes flickered from Eleanor's convincingly hysterical form to Brenda's panicked face. A routine, unannounced locker check was not explicitly ordered, but the doubt was now a living thing in the room. Later that night, as the facility settled into an uneasy quiet, a folded piece of paper was slipped under Eleanor's door. She picked it up with trembling, real hands now. It was a sketch, drawn on the back of a medication chart. It was a detailed, beautifully rendered drawing of the common room. And there, in the corner, was a perfect likeness of Nurse Brenda. Her hand subtly extended, taking a glittering object from a shelf behind the nurse's station. It was Mrs. Gable's ring. Leo had been observing far more than anyone realized. He had just given her a weapon. Eleanor lay in bed, the hidden sketch tucked under her mattress. Her heart was still pounding from the exertion of her performance. It had been terrifying, humiliating, but it had worked. She had taken control of the narrative. She was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the victim. She was the playwright, the director, and the lead actress in a desperate play for her life. She had weaponized her supposed instability and fired the first decisive shot. The battle for Oakhaven had begun, and for the first time since she'd been thrown inside, Eleanor allowed herself a small, grim smile. They had no idea what they had unleashed. The fallout from Eleanor's performance was immediate and electric. The air in Oakhaven, usually thick with a stagnant melancholy, now crackled with a new, volatile energy. Nurse Brenda was reassigned to a different wing. Her smugness replaced by a pinched, nervous fury. The official reason was to reduce patient agitation, but everyone knew. The rumor mill, the lifeblood of any closed institution, had begun to turn, fed by Leo's whispers and the other patients' sharp, observant eyes. Dr. Mercer's sessions with Eleanor changed. The tired paternalism was gone, replaced by a sharper, more clinical scrutiny. He was a man whose comfortable system had been jostled, and he didn't like it. "Your hallucinations seem remarkably specific, Eleanor," he said during their next session, steepling his fingers. "Nurse Brenda. A missing ring. It's almost narrative." Eleanor met his gaze, allowing a flicker of the vacant look to cloud her eyes before looking away, as if distracted by something he couldn't see. "The man in the vent told me you wouldn't believe me," she murmured, tracing a pattern on the arm of her chair. "He said you're on their payroll too." It was a dangerous gambit, accusing the doctor directly. But she had to maintain the facade of paranoia while simultaneously planting the idea that his staff was corrupt. She was walking a razor's edge, performing a high-wire act between calculated insanity and desperate sanity. "The man in the vent," Dr. Mercer repeated, writing something down. "And does this man have a name?" "He changes it," she whispered conspiratorially. "Today he's Robert. But he's not my Robert. They've stolen his voice too." A real tear, born of genuine grief for her stolen wedding ring and her stolen husband, welled in her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It was the perfect touch. Dr. Mercer's pen stilled. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something uncertain in his eyes. Doubt, or merely professional curiosity. She couldn't tell. Meanwhile, her alliance with Leo deepened. He became her eyes and ears. He was a low-priority patient, considered harmless and absorbed in his own world, which gave him a surprising amount of freedom to observe. He confirmed that Brenda had been questioned about the ring. He also brought Eleanor a new, terrifying piece of information. "Your son was here," he whispered one afternoon as they sat in the courtyard, the ever-present fence a stark reminder of their captivity. He met with Dr. Mercer in his office. He brought a woman. Sharp suit. Looked like a lawyer. Chloe. They were moving forward with their legal play, undoubtedly pressuring Mercer to make her commitment permanent, to declare her incompetent. The 72-hour hold could be extended indefinitely with the right signatures. Time, which had felt like an eternity, was now rushing past her at a terrifying speed. She needed to get a message out. The sketch of Brenda stealing the ring was her only hard evidence, a seed of truth that could sprout into an investigation. But how? Outgoing mail was monitored. Phone calls were a fantasy. Visitors were forbidden during the initial hold, and the only one who would come was David, and his visits were part of the problem. Her opportunity came from an unexpected source. Chaos. A new patient was admitted, a large, deeply agitated man named Frank who was suffering from severe alcohol withdrawal. On his second night, his DTIs set in with a vengeance. He began screaming, overturning furniture, believing the walls were crawling with insects. The night staff, already stretched thin, scrambled to contain him. Alarms blared. The hallway descended into a pandemonium of shouting and frantic movement. This was her chance. While the staff was distracted with Frank, Eleanor slipped out of her room. The nurse's station was momentarily deserted. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. This was it. A single, reckless act of defiance. She moved not like a confused old woman, but with the sharp, purposeful intent of the bank manager she had once been. She saw it immediately. A small, discarded envelope in a trash bin, a requisition form for medical supplies. It was addressed to Oakhaven, but it had a return address for the medical supply company in the city. It was her only shot. On the blank back, using a pilfered pen from a counter, she wrote in her smallest, most precise handwriting, the penmanship she used for balancing ledgers. Asterisk to whom it may concern, my name is Eleanor Vance. I am being unlawfully held at Oakhaven Wellness Center under a fraudulent 72-hour hold initiated by my son, David Vance, and his wife Chloe. This is a case of elder financial abuse. The enclosed drawing, made by another patient, depicts Nurse Brenda stealing a patient's ring, demonstrating systemic corruption. I am of sound mind. Please contact my attorney, Arthur Pendleton. His number is 555-0184. Help me, asterisk. She folded the sketch inside the makeshift envelope. She didn't have a stamp. She would have to rely on the kindness of a stranger, or sheer luck. She slipped out of the nurse's station and, seeing a stack of outgoing mail on a cart by the main door, ready for the morning pickup, she slid her letter between a water bill and a fundraising brochure. She retreated to her room just as the orderlies finally subdued Frank. The chaos subsided, leaving behind a ringing silence. Eleanor leaned against her locked door, her body slick with cold sweat. She had done it. She had thrown a message in a bottle into a vast, uncaring ocean. The chances it would reach someone who cared were infinitesimally small. But it was a chance. It was a thread thin as spider silk, connecting her to the world outside the fence. The next morning, Dr. Mercer appeared at her door, his face grim. David and Chloe stood behind him, their expressions a mask of somber concern. Chloe held a leather-bound portfolio. Eleanor, Dr. Mercer began, his voice heavy. Your family is here. They're very concerned that the 72-hour hold may not be sufficient for your stabilization. They've brought some documents to review, regarding your long-term care. Chloe gave a sorrowful smile. We just want what's best for you, Eleanor. Eleanor looked at them, her son the betrayer, his wife the architect, and the doctor the willing pawn. She felt a cold serenity settle over her. The performance was not over. In fact, the final act was about to begin. She looked past them toward the window, and let a slow, vacant smile spread across her face. The Phoenix has the account number now, she said, her voice a dreamy sing-song. The bird in the mail will tell him. David looked confused. Chloe's smile tightened. Dr. Mercer scribbled furiously on his chart. They thought it was nonsense. The ravings of a madwoman. But Eleanor knew it was a declaration of war. Her message was in the wind. The thread was cast. Now she just had to hold on long enough for someone somewhere to pull on the other end. The review hearing was not held in a courtroom, but in Dr. Mercer's office, a space that had been arranged to project an air of clinical authority rather than judicial impartiality. Eleanor was made to sit in a chair facing Dr. Mercer's desk, like a student summoned to the principal's office. David and Chloe sat off to the side, a united front of manufactured grief. A woman Eleanor didn't recognize, introduced as Ms. Albright from Adult Protective Services, sat with a tablet, her face professionally neutral. This was the tribunal that would decide her fate. Eleanor wore the scrubs they had given her. She had refused the nice clothes David had brought, understanding the power of optics. In her own clothes, she might look like a competent woman being wronged. In the standard issue scrubs, she looked like what they wanted her to be. A patient. An inmate. Mrs. Vance, Dr. Mercer began, his voice echoing in the tense room. We're here to review your progress and determine the most appropriate course of action for your care. Your family is deeply concerned that a discharge at this time would be premature. Chloe produced a soft, sympathetic sob, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. David reached over and squeezed her hand, his face a mask of anguish. The performance was flawless. Mom, David said, his voice cracking with practiced emotion. We just want you to get better. The things you've been saying. The accusations. It's not you. Eleanor focused on keeping her breathing even. She had to pick her moment with the precision of a surgeon. She couldn't just declare her sanity. She had to demonstrate it by systematically dismantling their lies, all while maintaining the fragile veneer of her instability to explain her previous behavior. Dr. Mercer reviewed his notes. Eleanor has been experiencing persistent delusions of a persecutory nature. She believes staff members are conspiring against her, that her family is trying to steal from her, and she reports auditory hallucinations, voices in the vents instructing her. Ms. Albright looked up from her tablet. And these beliefs are fixed, unshakable by reason. Quite, Dr. Mercer affirmed. It was time. Eleanor let her lower lip tremble. She looked at Ms. Albright, not at Mercer or David. She spoke in a quiet but clear voice, devoid of the sing-song cadence she had used before. The man in the vent isn't talking today, she said. He said he didn't need to, because the numbers speak for themselves. David shifted uncomfortably. Chloe's sympathetic mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing confusion. Numbers, Eleanor? Dr. Mercer asked, a hint of condescension in his tone. Eleanor kept her eyes locked on Ms. Albright. The number is $4,250. That's the monthly mortgage payment on David and Chloe's house in Crestview Hills. The number $1,200 is the lease payment for Chloe's BMW. The number $58,000 is the total I gave them for their anniversary trip to Bora Bora, which they told me was a business conference in Phoenix. She was reciting not delusions but facts. Cold, hard financial facts from the meticulous mental ledger she had kept for years. David paled. Mom, those are private matters. Are they? Eleanor asked softly, still addressing Ms. Albright. Or are they motive? The total number is $412,000 over the last 5 years. That is the sum of my instability, my desire to stop the bleeding. You see, Chloe burst out, her voice shrill. This is what she does. She obsesses over money. She turns love into transactions. Eleanor finally turned to look at her daughter-in-law. You're right, Chloe. It was a transaction. I was purchasing your affection. And I finally realized I was being grossly overcharged. The room was utterly silent. Ms. Albright's fingers were flying over her tablet screen now. Dr. Mercer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. This Financial fixation is part of the paranoia, Ms. Albright. A common symptom. Is it? Eleanor asked, her voice gaining a steely edge she no longer bothered to conceal. Or is it a rational response to exploitation? Ask them, Ms. Albright, about the special people they took to the French Laundry while I, the one who paid for it, was not invited. Is that my paranoia? Or their cruelty? David was staring at his shoes, his jaw clenched. Chloe looked like she wanted to strangle her. And the voices, Dr. Mercer, Eleanor continued, turning her gaze to him. You find it strange that my delusions are about being exploited for my money by my family? Isn't that a rather convenient psychosis for them? One that neatly justifies locking me away and taking control of everything. She was walking the line, using razor-sharp logic to defend herself, all under the pretense of explaining her delusions. She was using their weapon against them. The ring! Chloe suddenly exclaimed, a desperate, triumphant look in her eyes. She accused an innocent nurse of stealing. That's proof of her paranoia. The ring. Eleanor had been waiting for this. She let a confused, vacant look cloud her features again. She tilted her head as if listening to something. The man in the vent. He's laughing, she whispered. He said to look in Nurse Brenda's locker, in a small black pouch behind the sanitary products. She looked at Ms. Albright, her eyes wide with feigned, childlike earnestness. The voices are very specific about where people hide things they've stolen. The blood drained from Dr. Mercer's face. The detail was too precise, too intimate to be a random delusion. Ms. Albright looked from Eleanor's performative vacancy to Dr. Mercer's clear discomfort. I think, Ms. Albright said, her voice firm and official, that this hearing is adjourned pending further investigation. I will be speaking with Nurse Brenda immediately. And I will be reviewing all of Oakhaven's inventory logs for patient belongings. The gavel of bureaucracy had come down. Not a verdict of innocence, but a stay of execution. As Eleanor was led back to her room, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted, hollowed out. She had used the last of her strength to fight a battle that should never have been necessary. She had been forced to play the fool to prove she was not one. Back in her room, she looked out the reinforced window. The message was still out there, a phantom hope. The hearing had bought her time, but it had not won her freedom. The war was not over. David and Chloe were wounded, but they were not defeated. They would regroup. They would come back with a new strategy, a better lawyer, a more compliant doctor. The performance had to continue. But as she stood there, watching the sunset paint the courtyard fence in hues of orange and gold, a new, more terrifying thought occurred to her. What if her message had been found? What if it had been intercepted and destroyed? What if the thread she had cast had already been cut, and she was truly, utterly alone? The facade of the cunning strategist crumbled, and for a moment, she was just a terrified old woman, praying for a miracle. The days following the hearing were a strange, suspended silence. The atmosphere at Oakhaven shifted. Dr. Mercer was colder, more distant, his professional pride wounded. Nurse Brenda was gone, officially on administrative leave, a victory that felt hollow in the sterile silence of Eleanor's room. David and Chloe did not visit. The battle lines had been drawn, and they were regrouping, licking their wounds, no longer bothering with the charade of concern. It was in this quiet tension that the miracle happened. It was a Tuesday. A different social worker, a man named Mr. Evans with a no-nonsense demeanor and a sharp gaze, asked to see Eleanor. He didn't lead her to an office, but to a small, private visitation room. Sitting at the table, looking out of place in his expensive tailored suit, was her attorney, Arthur Pendleton. His presence was so jarring, so utterly impossible, that for a moment Eleanor thought she had finally, truly lost her mind. "Eleanor," Arthur said, standing up. His voice a familiar, gravelly anchor in the surreal storm of her life. "My God! Arthur! How?" He held up a crumpled, stained envelope. "The medical supply requisition. On the back, her tiny, frantic script was barely legible, but it was there. This was delivered to my office by a very confused male clerk at a medical supply company. He almost threw it out, but the word help caught his eye. He thought it was a prank, but he looked up my number and called. Arthur's eyes, usually so composed, blazed with a cold fury. What in God's name is happening here? The story tumbled out of her, not in the performative, calculated fragments she used with the staff, but in a raw, coherent torrent. The financial drain, the special people comment, the orchestrated 72-hour hold, the manipulation, the hearing. She showed him where she had hidden Leo's drawing under her mattress. Arthur listened, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. When she finished, he placed a steadying hand on hers. "We're getting you out of here. Today." It wasn't that simple, of course. Nothing ever was. But Arthur Pendleton was a pit bull in an expensive suit. He produced a court order for her immediate release, citing false imprisonment and lack of evidence for the hold. He had already filed a civil lawsuit against David, Chloe, and Oakhaven for conspiracy, elder abuse, and fraudulent imprisonment. The evidence, the detailed financial records Arthur had always advised her to keep, the sketch, the testimony of the social worker Ms. Albright, and now Eleanor's own powerful lucid account, was a damning tapestry of greed and manipulation. The discharge process was a blur of signed forms and returned belongings. When they handed her the small bag with her clothes and her wedding ring, her hands shook as she slipped the cool, familiar band onto her finger. It was the first real touchstone of her old life, a symbol of a love that had been pure, unlike the transactional horror that had followed. She walked out of Oakhaven's automatic doors a free woman, leaning on Arthur's arm. The outside air, even tinged with car exhaust, tasted like ambrosia. The sun felt like a personal benediction. She didn't look back. The legal war that followed was swift and brutal. Faced with a mountain of evidence, Oakhaven settled quickly, distancing themselves from the rogue actions of a single nurse and an overzealous family. But the real battle was with David and Chloe. They fought back, of course. They claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that they were only acting out of love. But their case crumbled under the weight of their own greed. The final blow came during a deposition when Chloe, under oath and facing perjury, was confronted with their bank statements. She broke down, not in remorse, but in rage, screaming at David that his pathetic mother had ruined their lives. The mask was off forever. The judge presiding over the civil case didn't just rule in Eleanor's favor. He excoriated them from the bench, his words a public shaming. He granted a permanent restraining order and awarded Eleanor a significant portion of the assets she had given them, enough to secure her future comfortably. Eleanor moved. She sold the house full of ghosts and bought a modern, secure apartment in a vibrant part of the city, a place with no memories of David's childhood, no echoes of Robert's absence. She reconnected with old friends, joined a book club, and started traveling, using the money they had so coveted to build a life they could never have imagined for her. She never spoke to David again. The son she had raised was gone, replaced by a stranger whose face she saw only in nightmares. It was a loss that ached like a phantom limb, a permanent, dull sorrow. But she did not let it consume her. She had risen from the ashes of the woman they had tried to destroy. One afternoon, a year after her release, a small package arrived at her new apartment. There was no return address. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a beautiful, framed sketch. It was a phoenix, its wings outstretched in a powerful, triumphant ascent, emerging from a nest of tangled, burning ledgers and broken chains. The detail was exquisite, the emotion raw and powerful. In the bottom corner, a single initial, L. Leo. He had gotten out too. Eleanor hung the sketch in her living room, a testament to her survival. She had weaponized her supposed instability, fought a war from the inside, and won. She had proven that the greatest strength is not in never being broken, but in choosing which pieces to pick up and which to leave behind. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the victim, the meek mother, the human ATM. She was the phoenix, and her account was now and forever closed. Settled was not a loud, celebratory thing. It was a deep, resonant quiet, like the silence in a forest after a long and raging fire has burned itself out. Eleanor's new apartment was not large, but it was filled with light in her own choices. Art that spoke to her, books she wanted to read, a kitchen stocked with food she enjoyed, not what she thought would impress occasional, ungrateful guests. The first few months of freedom were a process of reacquaintance. She had to relearn the simple rhythm of a day that belonged entirely to her. There was no dread of the phone ringing, no anxious scanning of her bank statements, no carefully constructing conversations to avoid triggering avarice masked as concern. The permanent restraining order was a legal document, but it functioned as a psychic shield, a bubble of safety she carried with her everywhere. Her attorney, Arthur Pendleton, became a steadfast friend. Their lunches were no longer about legal strategy, but about theater and politics and the absurdities of getting older. He never mentioned David unless she did, and she rarely did. The wound was too deep for casual conversation. The money from the settlement was significant, but it felt tainted, a constant reminder of the betrayal. So, she began to launder it through acts of joy and generosity. She funded a scholarship at the local community college for returning adult students, specifically for those studying finance or law. A small, private joke that made her smile. She took a small group of women from her new book club on a trip to Tuscany, their laughter among the olive groves a balm to her soul. This was what money was for, to build, to empower, to create memories, not to chain and control. But the past never truly leaves. It simply changes form. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she was sorting through a box of old photographs she had rescued from her old house. There he was, David at 6, gap-toothed and beaming, holding a wilting dandelion as if it were a royal scepter. The ache that rose in her chest was not the sharp, searing pain of fresh betrayal, but a heavier, more ancient sorrow. She mourned not the man he had become, but the boy he had been, the future she had believed in, the lineage that was now irrevocably broken. She did not cry. She simply placed the photograph back in the box, closed the lid, and put it on a high shelf in her closet. Some memories were not meant for daily viewing. Months turned into a year. The framed sketch from Leo held a place of honor in her living room. She often wondered about him, the quiet, brilliant artist who had been her ally in the abyss. She hoped he was somewhere, drawing in peace. His phoenix was more than a gift. It was a co-authored testament to their survival. The knock on her door, therefore, on an unremarkable Thursday, was a surprise. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, she saw a woman, her face obscured by a large bouquet of flowers. Cautiously, Eleanor opened the door, the chain lock still engaged. The woman lowered the flowers. 'Twas Chloe. She looked different. The sharp, polished edges were softened. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, and her face was free of the makeup she usually wore like armor. She looked tired and ordinary. "Eleanor," she said, her voice quiet. "Please. I just need 5 minutes." Every cell in Eleanor's body screamed to slam the door. But something in Chloe's posture, a defeat that seemed genuine, made her pause. After a long moment, she slid the chain lock off and opened the door, but she did not step aside to let her in. They stood in the hallway, the threshold of Eleanor's sanctuary a firm boundary. "What do you want, Chloe?" "I'm leaving him," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm filing for divorce." She held out the flowers, a beautiful, expensive bouquet of white lilies and blue delphiniums. Eleanor did not take them. "Why?" "Because I finally saw who he is. Who we became." Chloe's eyes welled with tears, but they seemed real this time, not the calculated drops she used to produce on command. After the settlement, he became unbearable, angry. He blamed me for everything. He said I was the one who was too greedy, that I pushed him too far. He started the same thing with me, Eleanor. Questioning my spending, my friends, telling me I was irrational. A bitter, ironic smile touched Eleanor's lips. The pattern repeated itself. The abuser, once denied his source of control, seeks a new one. I'm not telling you this for your sympathy, Chloe continued, wiping her eyes. I know I don't deserve it. I'm telling you because I am sorry. Truly deeply sorry. I was weak and ambitious, and I saw a path to a life I didn't want to work for. I poisoned your son against you. I am the reason you lost him. The apology hung in the air between them. It was everything Eleanor had thought she wanted to hear a year ago. Now, it felt like a historical account, a fact from a book about someone else's life. You didn't poison him, Chloe, Eleanor said, her voice calm and distant, like a judge delivering a verdict. The weakness was already in him. You just showed him how to use it. She looked at the flowers, then back at Chloe's face. I cannot forgive you. Not for my sake but for my own peace. Forgiveness would require me to reopen a door I have worked too hard to close. I hope you find a better path, but you will walk it away from me. Chloe nodded, a slow, accepting gesture. She had expected nothing less. She set the flowers down carefully on the hallway floor. Goodbye, Eleanor. Eleanor closed the door. She leaned against it, listening to the sound of Chloe's retreating footsteps fade away. She did not feel vindicated. She felt nothing but a profound, final stillness. The last ghost had been laid to rest. She left the flowers in the hallway. The building's cleaner would take them or they would wilt. They were not her burden to carry. That evening, she sat in her favorite chair, the city lights twinkling beyond her window, Leo's phoenix watching over her. The story was truly over. The ledger was balanced, the account was closed, and the silence that remained was not the silence of absence, but of wholeness. She was Eleanor Vance, whole unto herself. And that was more than enough. The encounter with Chloe had a surprising effect. It didn't reopen old wounds, but rather, it cauterized the last of them. The why had been answered, not with a dramatic confession, but with a pathetic human truth. Weakness and greed. It was almost banal. With that final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, Eleanor found a new energy, a purpose that was entirely forward-looking. She began to write. Not a memoir. The thought of reliving those days in such detail was abhorrent, but a guide. A clear-eyed, practical handbook titled The Financial Autonomy Audit. A guide for seniors. It was written in the same precise, no-nonsense tone she had used as a bank manager. It covered everything. How to spot the early signs of financial dependency, how to set unshakable boundaries with family, how to legally protect your assets, and crucially, the difference between helping and enabling. She included a chapter on the psychological tactics used by manipulators, using her own experience not as a sob story, but as a series of object lessons. She self-published it, and at Arthur's urging, did a single, carefully managed interview with a reputable financial magazine. The response was staggering. Letters and emails poured in, not from publishers, but from readers. A woman in Florida whose son had taken over her house. A man in Oregon whose daughter had convinced him to sign over power of attorney after a minor surgery. They all said the same thing. I thought I was alone. I thought I was going crazy. Your book gave me the words to fight back. Eleanor had stumbled into a sisterhood and brotherhood of survivors. The quiet, comfortable life she had built for herself suddenly felt too small. The settlement money, which had been sitting in conservative investments, now felt like a tool waiting to be used. One evening, over a glass of wine with Arthur, she laid out her plan. I want to start a foundation, she said. The Phoenix Trust. Arthur smiled, a genuine, proud smile. Tell me more. It would have 2 parts, she explained, her eyes alight with a passion he hadn't seen in decades. First, a legal aid fund. We would connect seniors who are being financially exploited with attorneys who specialize in elder law. We'd pay the retainer, level the playing field. She paused, taking a sip of wine. The second part is a public advocacy campaign. We need to change the conversation. It's not about elderly confusion. It's about crime. We need to shame the systems that enable it and empower the people who are targeted. The Phoenix Trust was launched 6 months later. Eleanor didn't just fund it, she ran it. She used her sharp, analytical mind to vet cases and her hard-won wisdom to counsel those who came to her, terrified and ashamed. She gave them the script she had written for herself in Oak Haven. You are not crazy. You are being robbed. Here is how we fight. She became a quiet but formidable force in the world of elder rights. She testified before a state Senate subcommittee. Her testimony so lucid and devastating that it led to the drafting of Eleanor's Law, which tightened the regulations around emergency psychiatric holds and increased the penalties for fraudulent guardianship. One afternoon, a young journalist came to interview her for a profile. She was a sharp, empathetic woman named Sarah. The interview was going well, covering the work of the trust, until Sarah asked a final, soft-spoken question. Ms. Vance, through all of this, the betrayal, the institutional trauma, this incredible work you're doing now, what is the one thing you've learned about family? Eleanor looked out the window of her office, the city sprawling below her. She thought of the boy with the dandelion, the man in the suit full of fury, the empty space where a son should be. I've learned, she said, turning her clear gaze back to Sarah, that family is not a title you inherit. It's a title you earn every day through respect and reciprocity. And when that contract is broken, you are under no obligation to keep paying the bill. The most sacred duty you have is not to your bloodline, but to your own soul. The article came out a week later. It was a powerful piece, but it was the final quote that resonated, shared across social media, printed out and pinned to bulletin boards in community centers. Eleanor did not see it. She was already in her office, reviewing the case file for a retired teacher in Ohio whose grandchildren were draining her pension. The work was her solace and her revenge. They had tried to bury her in a grave of avarice and paperwork. Instead, they had planted a seed. And from that seed, a forest of protection was now growing, its roots deep and strong, offering shade and shelter to those who walked the path she had been forced to carve alone. The phoenix had not just risen. She had built a sanctuary in the sky. Years bled into one another with a gentle rhythm. The Phoenix Trust became an institution, its work carried forward by a dedicated staff. Eleanor, now in her late 70s, gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations, transitioning to the role of founding chair emeritus. Her presence was a guiding light, her counsel sought on major decisions, but the frantic energy of the fight had mellowed into a steady, enduring glow. She moved from her city apartment to a small, charming cottage on the outskirts of a quiet town. It had a garden, a real one with soil that stained her knees and required patient tending. She found a profound peace in the simple logic of plants. Water them, give them sun, protect them from pests, and they would grow. It was a predictable, honest relationship that soothed a soul once fractured by the duplicity of those she loved most. Her social circle was small and cherished. Arthur Pendleton and his wife came for dinner every other Sunday. The women from her book club, now dear friends for over a decade, visited often, their conversations a lively mix of literature, world affairs, and the gentle, self-deprecating humor of aging. There was no performance here. No need to be anything other than who she was. The past was a country she no longer visited. The box of photographs remained on the high shelf, undisturbed. She heard, through the faint whispers of mutual acquaintances, that David had moved out of state after his divorce and had struggled to hold down a job. The news evoked no schadenfreude, only a distant, quiet pity. He was a ghost, and she had long since stopped being haunted. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was in her garden, pulling out the spent annuals. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. A young woman from the local historical society, doing a project on notable local women, had asked to interview her. Eleanor had agreed, not out of a desire for fame, but from a sense of duty to the story itself. Not her story, but the story of the fight. The woman, earnest and bright-eyed, set up a recorder on the patio table. They spoke for an hour about the trust, the legislative changes, the thousands of people who had been helped. And personally, Ms. Vance, the young woman asked, wrapping up, what would you say is your life's greatest accomplishment? The Phoenix Trust. Eleanor's Law. Eleanor smiled, a soft, weathered smile that reached her eyes. She looked past the interviewer, to the fiery maple tree at the bottom of her garden. "No, my dear," she said, her voice calm and sure. "My greatest accomplishment is my peace. The trust, the law. Those were consequences. They were the beautiful, unexpected flowers that grew from the compost of a terrible experience. But the real work, the hardest work, was learning to sit alone in a quiet room and be perfectly content with the company I found there." She paused, watching a lone leaf detach itself and spiral slowly to the ground. "For so long my life was a ledger. Credits and debits. What I was giving, what I was owed. I balanced everyone's account but my own. My son. They tried to make that ledger my tombstone. But I learned to close it. To open a new, unwritten book. And in this book, the only entry that matters is joy. A good cup of tea in the morning. The first rose of summer. The laughter of a friend. It is a book with no bottom line, because its value is infinite." The young woman was silent, absorbing the weight of the words. Eleanor stood up, brushing the soil from her hands. "That's all I have to say." After the interviewer left, Eleanor remained in the garden as the sun dipped low. She felt the cool air on her skin, heard the chatter of sparrows settling in for the night. There was no yearning for the past, no anxiety for the future. The ledger was closed. The account was settled. The story was told. She was simply Eleanor. And that, finally, was everything. The seasons turned, each one a quiet affirmation of the life Eleanor had built. Her cottage became a beloved landmark in the small town, not for its famous occupant, but for the magnificent, slightly overgrown garden that spilled over its fence, a generous gift to every passerby. She took up watercolor painting, a hobby she'd always dismissed as frivolous. Her subjects were simple: a single pear on her kitchen windowsill, the gnarled branches of the old oak tree in her garden, the play of evening light on her weathered patio stones. She wasn't trying to be great. She was simply bearing witness to the beauty of an ordinary, well-loved life. One afternoon a letter arrived. It was from a woman in a distant state, her handwriting elegant but shaky with age. She wrote that she had read Eleanor's book years ago, and it had given her the courage to confront her own daughter about the money that was mysteriously disappearing from her account. It had been painful, she wrote, and they no longer spoke. But she was safe. She lived independently, had a small circle of friends, and had just adopted a cat. She ended the letter with, "You taught me that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Thank you for my freedom." Eleanor held the letter for a long time, a single tear tracing the map of wrinkles on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of completion. This was the final, perfect echo of her struggle. Her pain had been alchemized into another woman's peace. The cycle was complete. That evening, she sat in her favorite armchair, a soft blanket over her knees, a cup of chamomile tea steaming on the table beside her. The fire crackled in the hearth. On the wall, Leo's phoenix watched over her, its vibrant wings forever caught in a moment of glorious ascent. She looked at it and smiled. There were no more battles to fight, no more ledgers to balance, no more words that needed to be said. The story of the betrayal, the fight, the foundation, it was all a prologue to this profound and simple quiet. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and the faint, sweet perfume of the jasmine that grew outside her window. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs, a quiet drum marking a life that was, finally and entirely, her own. And in the deep, welcoming silence, Eleanor Vance was, at last, perfectly and completely free. If you enjoyed my story and would like to help me create more, your support through a small donation would mean the world to me. Thank you so much in advance. Now, tell me, what would you have done in this person's place? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. I'm always eager to know your perspectives and where you first discovered this story. If you'd like to hear more real-life stories like this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more waiting for you. With warm regards, Vin.